Hey vintage lovers, it's Sarah from Bold Wallflowers, and today I'm testing 3 paint wash ratios using Fusion Mineral Paint in a taupe color. I will be testing a 1:3, a 1:6, and a 1:10, but I'm doing something a little different. I'll be applying them to the vertical board to see how they hold up in real conditions. Will they drip? Will they streak? We're going to find out. I've always leaned towards a 3:1 ratio because it really gave that strong tint and solid coverage, kind of the traditional paint wash look. But lately I've really come to like a 1:6 ratio. It creates a lighter, more translucent wash and gives me more working time, which makes wiping and blending a lot more forgiving. Then there's a 1:10 ratio. I've seen a lot of people using it on social media with no wipe back at all. It looks beautiful, but my concern is whether it becomes too watery for a vertical surface. Does it just drip down the piece before you can work with it? I don't know. So today I'm testing all 3 side by side with the same paint, same wood, and same vertical setup to figure out which ratio is actually the most manageable and what gives the best result. So I divided a plywood board into 3 sections to test the different paint wash ratios. I'm using Fusion Mineral Paint in the color Algonquin. It usually gives that soft, raw wood look I like. I've mixed each wash in a jar, 1 part paint to either 3, 6, or 10 parts of water. The more water, the lighter and more subtle the effect. Let's see how they look when applied. First up is the 1:3 ratio. I applied it to the vertical board and you'll see that there's barely any dripping, which makes it very manageable. I let it sit for a few minutes, then I wiped it back with a clean rag, and it gave a nice wash of color, slightly deeper, less translucent, but you could still see the grain really easily through. Next is a 1:6 ratio. Because it's more diluted, I did get a few drips while applying it to the board. So if you're using a thinner mix like this, consider taping off or covering any areas you wouldn't want the wash running onto. Same process as before. I applied it, let it sit a few minutes, then wiped it back with a clean rag. The result is a much lighter version of 1:3 ratio, more subtle, but still softens the wood tone nicely. So finally, the 1:10 ratio. This one definitely dripped a lot more at first. No surprise considering the amount of water. After applying it, I used a dry brush to fan it out and to control the drips further. I let it sit a few minutes, and then I saw that it needed another fanning out with the dry brush just to even things up. Once it did dry, I didn't notice a huge difference between the 1:6 and the 1:10. Both give that light paint wash, so if you're going for that subtle look, either will work. Because the paint wash looked a bit splotchy on the first side of the plywood, I decided to flip the board and try again. This time I wiped the surface down with a very wet rag first, just enough to make sure the wood was evenly damp before applying the 1:6 paint wash ratio. I followed the same process as before, and you can see the immediate difference. The paint wash went on much smoother and the finish was far less splotchy. This is the paint wash on the dry wood, splotchy and uneven, and here's the same wash on the pre-wet surface, much more even and no patchiness. After testing water, I also wanted to try Dewaxed shellac under the paint wash, kind of as a preconditioner or sealer. I've done this before on oak that was bleeding through into my paint wash, and it worked really well to block that bleeding. But this time on plywood, not so much. Even though I followed the same process and even added a second coat of the paint wash, the finish still just looked off. It didn't blend well and the results just weren't great. So here's my takeaway. Use shellac only if you're dealing with bleed through, and always test it first because it's not always the right solution, especially on plywood. After testing all 3 paint washes, the 3:1, the 6:1, and the 10:1 ratio, here's what I found. The 6:1 and the 10:1 ratios both dripped on the vertical surface, which is to be expected with thinner mixes, but the drips weren't unmanageable. And with the 10:1 especially, I was able to feather the paint back out using a dry brush once it started to drip, and that worked well to even things out. I was surprised by the big jump in color between the 3:1 and the 6:1, but the difference between the 6:1 and 10:1 was much more subtle to my eyes. I think that's partially because I wiped back the 6:1 and left the 10:1 to dry fully, which gave it much more time to settle into the grain. So really, it comes down to how much effort you want to put into working the paint. Do you want something super subtle and you're willing to babysit? the drying process with a dry brush, go with a 10-to-1. If you'd rather a shorter process, a 6-to-1 with a white back is a great middle ground. And if you want that deeper color without losing the grain visibility, 3-to-1 still holds its own. So now, as for the board, it was an old plywood board I had laying around, and let's just say it's not my favorite surface that I've ever paint washed. It turned out so splotchy. I decided then to try wetting the surface, which is actually how I usually prep the pieces before applying the paint wash. And you can really see why it's such a common practice. It definitely helps to even out the tone, especially on porous or patchy woods. Then I experimented with a layer of shellac on one section, thinking maybe a sealed surface would help, but honestly, it didn't improve things at all. The paint wash just sat weirdly on top of the shellac, even though it was a dewaxed shellac, and the color looked off. I thought, let's try a second coat, and it still didn't look great. So shellac as a base for paint wash is really not worth the effort. Your best bet, wet the surface first and work with a thin, even brush strokes. Keep a dry brush nearby to feather as needed, especially with your high water ratios like a 10-to-1. I hope this test helped you figure out which ratio might work best for your next project. Let me know in the comments what paint ratios you've tried, and if you've got a technique that works especially well, I'd love to hear it. And if you found this helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss future test videos and tutorials.